So I wanted to talk about tonight just this sense of transcending from, our ordinary world, as a goal of spirituality. So that's typically how many of us think about spirituality. Oh, I'd like to use spirituality to get, sort of get beyond myself, to get, some greater degree of peace, greater degree of happiness. And it's almost implied in there somehow as a rejection of this current condition. Somehow we assume that the current condition is somehow inadequate, and some future condition with different circumstances, of course, will fulfill my desire for peace and happiness. So one of the first things that we do when we are out playing spiritual pursuit is that we deny whatever is present in hopes of attaining, realizing, finding something better. So one of the images, especially in Eastern traditions, is the image of a lotus flower, which, if you've ever seen one, it's really a pristine, white, beautiful flower that blooms, that grows out of the mud. So there's the symbolism of the beauty, the pristine nature of it being untouched by the mud from which it's arisen, and yet it's still rooted in the mud, still nourished by the mud, still in many ways dependent on the mud for its survival. It doesn't exist long as a cut flower. It's very much integrated with the mud that it's arisen out of. So the spiritual symbolism there is pretty obvious. So in spirituality, we can take this sense of, I just want to transcend, I just want to get beyond this sense of limitation, a sense of lack, sense of unworthiness, and leave that behind and gain some hoped for transcendent state, which we can call enlightenment or awakening. And one of the problems with something that is close to being true is that it's also can be dangerous, right? So that statement is close to being true in that when we realize for ourselves in our own direct experience, not as a theory or as a concept, but in our own direct experience, that what we fundamentally are, what we truly are, our true nature is awareness. That realization is immensely liberating, because we find out to our surprise that that degree of freedom isn't dependent on resolving all of our conditioned limitations, all of our issues, all of our dysfunctional habits. It's not dependent on that. And we find ourselves free of that because we realize that awareness, that consciousness has always been there. And when we realize that is free, and in a sense has always been free but unnoticed, it is immensely liberating, right? And there can be a tendency when that is first realized to grasp onto it as, well, as if we had just reached the promised land and we ain't going back. That can be the feeling. Like I've searched, I've tried, I've made all this effort, I've meditated for years, and yes, gratefully, finally, I've had this realization. It can feel seductive in that way, like I don't want to let this go. I'm going to hang on to this experience for dear life. You know, I've worked hard to get here. It's so obvious now, and I don't want to let it go. Right? It can feel like that, right? And for some time, it may continue to feel like that. This can be called the honeymoon period, right? And I don't know, we could try to stretch that out as long as possible, hopefully forever, but that actually doesn't turn out that way. The reason that I say this sense of transcendence from you know, normal everyday life is immensely liberating, but also can be dangerous in the sense that we can hang on to it as in hopes of it being a permanent state. Okay. Awakening is actually freedom from any permanent state. It's the recognition that what we are is beyond any state, any emotional state, any mental state, any physical state, any ideological state. It is free of all of that. It is what notices all of that. It is what all of that happens within. But for a time after first encountering this awareness, it can feel like such a relief, so joyful, so liberating, that we take the feelings that arise from that sense of realization to be the realization itself. They're not, but they tend to get packaged together, and we can hope for this continuation of, you know, immense bliss, joy, relief. But sooner or later, like every experience, those byproducts of awakening will tend to fade. And when they tend to fade, it's, you know, we can have this sense of grasping after them, like, no, no, don't leave me. What have I done wrong? You know, don't go. But even that fear and anxiety and sort of disappointment and, oh no, my awakening moment is fading. No, the byproducts are changing. The awakeness, the awareness is still fully present. It's fully present for the fading of the byproducts. But we like the byproducts so much, we think, oh no, don't, you know, don't leave me. Okay. One of the dangers there is that it can be tempting to pretend that we're not after awakening. Well, particularly if we tell all our friends that, you know, when we feel the grips of conditioning coming back in, maybe contraction over some incident, we might find ourselves trying to either ignore that or hide it, right? Hide it. Don't let anybody see me being contracted, right? I'm supposed to be awake now, right? Can you see the irony of that? I recognize myself as awareness, and yet there's a state of contraction happening. I've become identified with that to the extent that, I'm trying to dismiss it or hide it or protect it somehow. From whom? From awareness. Awareness is right there. There's even a worse trap than that. The worst trap is that we may come to believe that because I've had an awakening experience, whatever contraction that expresses itself is still an enlightened function, right? I'm awake, and therefore what I do is enlightened. No, no, no. At any moment, we may be awake or not so much. At any moment. Any belief that we have that contraction may never enter our lives again is, well, it's arrogant, right? We don't know. We have to be willing to face that possibility. If we find that, we have to be willing to see that. We have to be willing to look at it. So even though, again, back to the symbol of the lotus flower, even though the lotus flower has bloomed, it's still connected to its origins. And there, we may be awake in certain areas of our life, like maybe on a mental level, but maybe not so much or not very much at all on a heart level, in terms of being clear at our emotional level, being clear on, caring, compassion level, love. So any assumptions that we make about permanence of a state is flawed. Any state of experience, any contraction that we feel even after awakening is something to be looked at. So it's actually that very human, very personal kinds of experience gives us the material to work with to further refine it. Right? It's almost as if life continues to give us opportunities to see what we may have seen, but maybe not completely, thoroughly, deeply. We get to see it maybe in a slightly different way, or at a different time, or maybe when we're tired or grouchy to start with, how about now? How about now? Can that conditioning be seen for what it is now? And so I see life continuing to offer these, learning experiences, right? Challenges, tests, Are you really as awake as you think you are? How about under this circumstance? There's a quote, it's actually a pretty harsh quote in Gospel of Thomas, one of the Gnostic Gospels, where Jesus says, if you bring forth that which is within you, it will save you. If you do not bring forth that which is within you, it will destroy you. So that's what we're talking about here, is to allow whatever remains unseen to be seen, to be brought forth, to be looked at, to be brought into the light of awareness. So that's actually really our job. Our job isn't actually to fix the conditioning or to make it go away. We don't actually have the power to do that. Why? Because the only thing that wants to fix our conditioning is our ego. Like, I want to improve myself, so I want to fix that. I want to feel better. I want to make that go away. So that movement to try to make it go away is ego-driven. Okay, so that's totally different from the willingness to be seen, to allow to arise, right? To allow everything to be as it is, to be seen clearly. That's within our power, to allow it to arise. It will arise anyway, but I mean, we can use our, energy and personal willpower to try to stuff it back down, ignore it, pretend it's not there, be afraid to see it. But it doesn't go anywhere. It's trying to suppress it is actually energizing it, because we're basically telling that energy, that energy of contraction, like, I don't feel up to dealing with you. I've concluded that you're bigger than me, and therefore I'm not going to face you. Okay. But when we understand that what is facing that conditioning isn't our personal willpower, doesn't actually have anything to do with willpower, it has to do with willingness. The willingness to face it, the willingness to allow it to express itself, and for us not to run away while it's doing it, to just be there, listen to what it has to say, see it, see what belief we were holding that was not true, about ourselves, about the other person. So we can do that. We can be present for it. It's what awareness is doing already, right? Awareness is already present for everything that's ever happened in your entire life. So the only difference is now we have the opportunity to do that consciously, to be present for whatever does arise. Because that, out of that mud is where the transformation actually happens. We may think, well, if I just transcend enough, all of that other conditioning will disappear. Again, like some statements, there is some truth to that. If we have a moment of awakening, some conditioning may just be resolved in that moment. Usually not all, usually not anywhere near all, but some of it may be. And in all likelihood, there'll be enough to work with afterwards. The advantage of awakening first is that it's easier to look at our own conditioning because we don't feel so personally involved in it. We can view it more from awareness, noticing our conditioned behaviors, conditioned habits, tendencies, dysfunctionality, all of that. from the point of awareness, there's actually not a problem. From the point of our humanity, it doesn't feel good. It feels out of alignment with what we know to be true on a deeper level. So it's really coming more into that alignment. So it's really in that very human part of ourselves that that transformation can continue. Because if we're not willing to face those contracted areas, they will continue to pull our energy back. Maybe not all the time, but often enough that it saps our energy. It pulls us away from a clear space back into contraction. So that transformative movement happens within our humanity. It's allowed by the recognition of our awareness being untouched by that conditioning. Makes it much, much easier. But we still have to, on a very human level, be willing, be honest enough with ourselves that we can face that. We don't have to face it all at once. And we also don't have to go looking for it. Life is good at that. Life is good at presenting circumstances that may be challenging from time to time. It can sometimes feel like too much. If it truly does feel like it's too much, like I can't handle this at this moment, we can ask life, in an honest way. I'm willing to face this, but I need to do it more slowly than how it's being presented in this moment. That's okay. One of the things that I've noticed is that, for most people, when we look back on our lives, the times in our life that, we could say in retrospect were the most transformative, in terms of moving us towards greater realization, those moments are very often the most challenging ones. It's actually moments that are really challenging that bring a lot of people even into spirituality at all. Moments, situations like a messy divorce or, being fired unjustly, let's say, from a job, a life-threatening illness to ourselves or someone close to us, loss of a loved one, those kinds of heart-wrenching situations that have occurred to all of us in some form. I'm not saying that we should like those situations. I'm not saying we should or need to relive those situations. But when we look back on it, most people, if they really consider it, would say, yes, as difficult as that was, it transformed me somehow. It made me a more mature person, a more open person, a more loving person, perhaps. It can have the opposite effect too, right? But if we really see our own responsibility in those situations. See that our own actions were deeply, one might say thoroughly, controlled by our conditions, upbringing, schooling, parenting, teachers, boyfriends, girlfriends. We can see that conditioning in ourselves has created a pattern of behavior in ourselves that we're, all of us spend a great deal of time trying to work through. When we can really see that clearly in ourselves, it gives us the ability to see it clearly in the other person, seeing that they too are struggling with their conditioning. They might even not know that. They may be, so deeply involved in their conditioning that they don't even know that they're conditioned. It's possible. It's common, actually. But when we can see it in ourselves, we can see that awareness is already functioning in the other person, and it's filtered, tainted by conditioning, tainted by experiences that happened to them that weren't entirely of their own choice. Mostly not of their own choice. Mostly a matter of circumstance. What economic condition you were born into, what schools you went to, what country you were born to, what religion, what ideology, all of that contributes to what we take ourselves to be. None of those things in themselves are self, right? They're not my self. My perspective based on my economic upbringing isn't essentially me, but that in combination with all these other forms of conditioning, we take to be us, right? Take to be, well, that's just who I am. After a while, it doesn't, until we really catch on to what this conditioning is and how pervasive it is, we can easily conclude, well, that's, just how I am. I guess I'll always be like that. But that is the area where transformation can happen. And it can happen only if we do it without self-judgment. Right? So if something arises, let's say anger arises, if we immediately go to self-judgment about it, we miss the opportunity to really see it for what it is. We make some, global conclusion about ourselves. Well, I'm just a mean person because I got angry today. Happens often. Therefore, what I am is a mean person. Me equals meanness. That's what I am. Right? But if we really see it clearly, we see an incident that doesn't characterize our entire life. Sometimes we're a pleasant person, happy person, but sometimes, maybe more often than we'd like, we find ourselves caught in anger. Right? So again, our job is not to get rid of it, it's actually to see it clearly. And the only way we can see it clearly is to allow it to be there. It doesn't mean that we have to act it out, but we have to be willing to be present, to see it welling up in ourselves, to get a good look at it. And if we find that that anger is directed outwards, more to ourselves, but let's just say for now, directed outwards, that there's some external trigger. When that happens, anger happens here. Right? If that's how we view the world, that somehow the world should conform to what I want it to be, then I could be happy and not angry. Well, that's not going to happen. Right? Yeah, I mean, we can hope that the world changes to be what I want it to be, but if that's our game plan, it's just not going to happen, right? So when we can see it clearly, we might just decide, well, maybe it's time for another strategy. If I can't control what happens around me, and then sometimes what happens around me makes me angry, maybe I just need to change my assumptions and look at pulling the responsibility back from the other person back to myself. So by what I mean by that is that we can see the possibility of responding to whatever situation may be happening, generated from the other person. How do I respond to that? You know, is it useful? Is it functional to respond with anger? You know, does it improve my relationship with the other person? You know, does it make me a happier person? Is that what I really want? Do I really want to create separation with the other person? Do I really want to allow my peace to be disturbed by something somebody else does? If so, why would I want that? Why would I want to squander my own energy because of what someone else does? So this might sound like, well, then you just sort of roll over and let anything happen. That's actually not at all what allowing everything to be as it is means. What it does mean is to recognize that that is what's happening, not argue with the fact that it is happening. And it then leaves you free to decide how to respond. You're not squandering all your energy arguing about why the other person shouldn't have done what they did, why they're to blame, why they're wrong, why they should be different, on and on, okay? All of which is arguing with life. We argue with life, we suffer. So we can also recognize that if, again, looking back on our lives, if it was all, you know, just fun and good times and pleasant as can be and everything went our way, would we ever change? I mean, would we ever really mature? Or would we just be in it for the pleasure, the fun? You know, never discovering anything deeper than that. You know, I'd suggest that it's really the more complex times, the more challenging times, you know, let's say the more, I don't know, ethically challenging times, morally challenging times, where we can really discover who we are. Without those, we wouldn't actually know what kind of character was present, what our deepest intentions were. You know, if we've never been challenged in that regard, we may think we know how we'd respond in a certain situation, but we don't actually know. We can't actually know. It's actually those situations that help us realize what our choices really are, help us decide, you know, where my deepest nature calls me to respond from. It actually, those situations actually inform us. So when we talk about, you know, transformative experiences, we don't have to wait for, you know, grand, life-changing, traumatic experiences. Those may or may not happen. hopefully, hopefully, you know, for our overall peace, relatively infrequently. Not everyone is that fortunate. But what we can do in our day-to-day life is to see from where are we acting. You know, just, I don't know, going to the grocery store at the checkout counter, encountering a friend casually, you know, from where are we relating to the other person? You know, are we, I don't know, trying to impress the other person, trying to, you know, do a game of one-upmanship? You know, are we being superficial, dismissive, judgmental? How are we responding? Are we responding from a connection as we are meeting with another, you know, living creation? You know, we don't have to talk about it in that way, but we can sense into it that way, sense into that deep connection with the other person, and then we can talk about, well, we can talk about anything, but we're doing it from a much deeper perspective, a deeper connection, and people can feel that. You know, it's actually how we can transmit our love and compassion and happiness and peace out in the world. So that's different than being out in the world and believing what would be good for the world is if the other person changes who they think they are, and I know what's best, and you know, if I can do it with an attitude, I can do it with anger. Can you see that that doesn't really transmit what we're hoping to transmit? If our goal is to transmit, I don't know, peace, happiness out into the world, the only way to do that is by being peaceful and joyful in our presence out in the world. You know, to do that out of anger or opposition, or out of an attitude that I know best or the other person's wrong, that doesn't help. So even those situations are opportunities to really look at how we are responding in this moment. Just day-to-day activities offer plenty of opportunities to look and see. So this is our willingness to sort of, you know, drop down into the mud, see how it is nourishing what we want to nourish, and how it's not seeing clearly, you know, and being willing to see those places as well. So like I said, the transformation really happens at the human level. The transcendent level is very much, in a sense, already present. You know, so the effort is really to clear away the debris that is causing us not to see that. And even after we've seen it, gotten a good glimpse of it, maybe even had a sense of it abiding in our lives, there may still be, very likely, unavoidably, things still to be seen through. That penetration of our humanity by awareness is something that has no apparent end to it. There's always more to see. Okay. If we find that we're continually repeating the same kinds of contracted behavior, those are the areas that we really need to look at, rather than just dismiss it. Well, that's just who I am. You know, those are really the areas to look at. Byron Katie has this wonderful expression, karma is just an unexplored belief. Right? Something that we believe, a view about ourselves, about other people, about the world, that we believe is true, causes us to behave in a certain way. It can be a simple belief. It can be, you know, I demand that the other person be grateful when I do something for them. You know, just, you know, maybe they will, maybe they won't. You don't know. You know, but if that's our belief, that's how the world should work, and when it doesn't work that way, you know, we get thrown for a loop. Then we are the victim. You know, we get to suffer, and as long as we don't explore that belief, we will continue to suffer over and over again. Right, waiting for the other person to change. So this, you know, life is, I mean, life in itself is a teacher, right? We can have, you know, outside teachers that may be helpful in pointing in a certain direction, suggesting an avenue to look. That can be helpful, right? There's also such a thing as our inner teacher. In India, they call it Satguru, inner teacher. This is the place of our sort of inner authenticity. You know, what we really want, what we're, you know, how sincere are we? How honest are we with ourselves? You know, it's not the superior voice that tells us you shouldn't have done that, you screwed up again. It's not that voice at all. It's much deeper than that. It's just the, you know, authentic voice that can, you know, point to the true north, let's say. Okay, and then there's life, right? So, you know, the outside teacher, the inner teacher, sometimes they, you know, have to resort to concepts because we're, you know, resorting to words. All words are concepts. But life has a way of sort of cutting through that conceptual veil. You know, life can get real. Life can bring us to a point where we're sort of hold our feet to the fire. You know, it can push us to a place where we can no longer dismiss what may be arising. And, you know, there are times when we can say, well, you know, what's happening now isn't fair. You know, arguing with life, right? What we do know is whatever's happening is what's happening. We can argue that it shouldn't be, or we can acknowledge, yes, I don't like it, but that is what's happening right now. So what's my response? You know? It's like the 5 stages of dying that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about. You know, the first one being denial, right? You know, it can't be happening to me. You know, arguing. So the sooner that, I mean, that may apply to, you know, dying, but it also applies to when, you know, a difficult situation suddenly arises. We tend to go through those 5 steps, the final one being, you know, allowing, you know, acceptance that that is what's happening. And then the more quickly we can get through those 5 steps rather than days or months, if it's seconds or minutes, it can save us a great deal of energy and allows us to use, our energy, which is limited, for actual, productive use to resolve whatever needs to be resolved in that moment. So that's the sort of insistence of life. If we haven't seen something, we get to see it again. If we still haven't seen it, maybe we get to see it again. Maybe the stakes are raised to the point that we can't ignore it any longer. And we can be, annoyed with life for being that insistent, but it's also a form of grace. It might be harsh grace, but it's a grace in the sense of life insisting that we look at this aspect that is causing us to remain unaware within a certain area. Life may push us there. Life has that kind of gritty reality to it sometimes. We don't have to like it, right? But it can be much more real than a conceptual teaching. So both all 3 kinds of teachings are useful. Right? But life has a transformative value to it. So to go back to the original analogy of the lotus arising from the mud, no mud, no lotus, right? It's the willingness to grow out of unawareness, where we can't really see our way through sometimes, but being willing to pursue that yearning in a direction, to be willing to look at whatever needs to be looked at clearly, non-judgmentally, till it's seen through, to be willing to face whatever arises. Because what we are is beyond all that, but we can't get there by bypassing it. We can't make a end run around our conditioning and disregard it forever. We can wake up without resolving our conditioning, but eventually that awareness is, well, it's a bit like a jealous lover. It sort of wants all of you. It wants a unified whole of expression of life, and anything that obscures that will eventually ask to be seen.